So, in this video, I want to talk about one of the most incredible yet disturbing novels I've ever read, which is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. So, I've been reading this book over the course of the past 2 years. I've read it 7 or 8 times now, if you count the audiobook. And I actually read it recently, a final time, in preparation for this lecture. And every time I thought I was done with this book, and thought, that was great, but I could probably move on, something kept drawing me back, and I kept thinking, no, there's something else here that I need to keep thinking about. And I think what really astonished me about the book and what kept drawing me back was the truly incredible writing. This is by far the best writing I've ever seen in a book, and I've never seen it just so stylistic and so virtuosic. And yet, despite this being the most beautiful writing I've ever seen, it's all in service to describing some of the most horrifying things I've ever seen put to page. It's describing utter mayhem and debauchery and evil. I remember the first time I read this book, I had this distinct feeling that I'm reading something that's just pure evil. And yet I couldn't stop reading it because it was just so astonishing, so hauntingly beautiful. And there are so many complicated ideas. It's not just about the writing, but what's being conveyed. The use of metaphor, the way McCarthy can just take the most random thing in nature and weave together this beautiful metaphor, which becomes a commentary on some other aspect of life. The main themes of the book are surrounding the nature of violence and war. And yet it's also one of those books that it feels like it contains the entire universe in it. It feels like every facet of life, there's something to be said. McCarthy has some commentary about every kind of aspect of existence. I mean, not literally, because there's no way a person can contain the entire universe in a book, but it often feels like that. It often feels like there's just so many ideas being expressed, not just about violence and war, but about fate, about the nature of destiny, about so many things, which I'll be getting into. And I should also mention, viewer discretion is advised for this video, because this is by far the most messed up thing that I've ever read. It is so grotesquely violent. And some of the imagery is just utterly unpleasant. And yet again, I couldn't stop reading. And so this lecture will be mostly about the incredible, incomparable writing of the book and just displaying it and just displaying how well put together the sentences are, as well as the philosophical themes that are conveyed by the writing, because there is a lot of philosophy in this. And I'm not going to be summarizing the plot too much, because in a way there is no plot. It's pretty aimless. The characters just marauder around the southern United States and northern Mexico, not really aiming towards anything in particular. And I don't think it's the plot which actually carries the book. I think it's more so the writing. Although at the end, the plot really starts to kick off, and that's where it becomes very, very interesting. And so I will be going into the plot as it pertains to the ending of the book. So let's begin. So the main character of this book is known only as the Kid. He's born in the 1800s in Tennessee, and his mother dies in childbirth, giving birth to him, and he runs away from home. Becoming more and more distant from his origins. He's heading out west somewhere, not anywhere in particular. It doesn't feel like he has any particular destination in mind. He's just traveling. And of the kid, as he travels, it's written, only now is the child divested of all that he has been. His origins are become remote, as is his destiny, and not again in all the world's turning will there be terrain so wild and barbarous, to try whether the stuff of creation may be shaped to man's will, or whether his own heart is not another kind of clay. So right away, we see an example of just some of the incredible writing and incredible prose that's found throughout the book. And what this is saying really sets the stage for the rest of the book. It's saying that this adventure, this journey which this kid is taking, is going to be the ultimate test to know whether humans have will and agency, whether they can alter their environments, or whether in truth they are altered by their environments, whether fate carries us along. And so it's this clash between fate and will, between the agency of mankind versus the trajectory of the universe. And this is a common theme in McCarthy's work, as far as I know. The nature of destiny, the nature of fate, is something that comes up often, and it's coming up here as well. Now, this book takes place in America, in the southern United States, right after the Mexican-American War. So an interesting time for the United States. But there's something very thoroughly American about the book. especially about the nature of manifest destiny and the promises of riches which kept driving settlers west. And this feverish urge to just colonize the entire continent, as well as to get rid of the original inhabitants. Now, while the kid is the main character of the book, another character really steals the show. And I think the entire book is actually about this character. This character is the judge, and he is arguably the entire point of the book. What he represents, the things he says, he takes up most of the screen time, anyways. And this is his introduction. So, what's happening during the scene is that while the kid is traveling, he's attending some sort of a sermon given by a reverend taking place in a tent. And the judge is introduced like this. An enormous man, dressed in an oilcloth slicker, had entered the tent and removed his hat. He was bald as a stone, and he had no trace of beard, and he had no brows to his eyes, nor lashes to them. He was close on to 7 feet in height, and he stood smoking a cigar, even in this nomadic house of God, and he seemed to have removed his hat only to chase the rain from it, for now he put it on again. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it is my duty to inform you that the man holding this revival is an impostor. He holds no papers of divinity from any institution recognized or improvised. He is altogether devoid of the least qualification to the office he has usurped, and is only committed to memory a few passages from the good book for the purpose of lending to his fraudulent sermon some faint flavor of the piety he despises. In truth, the gentleman standing here before you, posing as a minister of the Lord, is not only totally illiterate, but is also wanted by the law in the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Arkansas, on a variety of charges, the most recent of which involved a girl of 11 years, I said 11, who had come to him in trust, and whom he was surprised in the act of violating while actually clothed in the livery of his God. Not 3 weeks before this, he was run out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, for having congress with a goat. Yes, lady, that is what I said. Goat. So the judge just kind of walks in on this sermon and accuses the reverend of being a child molester and also someone who's into bestiality. And he comes in and he just says this with such confidence and in such an articulate manner that the entire crowd just turns on the reverend. And they're all whipped up and they attack the reverend and do something to him. And the kid manages to escape from the tent. And later he goes to a bar where the judge is already seated, and this exchange takes place. Judge, how did you come to have the goods on that no account? I should also mention before I proceed that the use of punctuation is very, very sparse in this book. There are no quotations, and it's actually sometimes hard to tell who's talking. You can pretty much decipher it, but there's a distinct lack of punctuation, and there's also a distinct disregard for like some of the rules of writing, so to speak. For example, the rule that you're supposed to use the word "and" only at only once in a sentence. McCarthy just completely breaks that and has his own style of writing, and it's just so good, and it's just so engaging to read. I should also mention that this exchange, these words right now, they weren't spoken by the kid, but they were spoken by someone else at the bar. But let's continue. Goods, said the judge. When was you in Fort Smith? Fort Smith? Where did you know him to know all that stuff on him? You mean the Reverend Green? Yes, sir. I reckon you was in Fort Smith before you come out here. I was never in Fort Smith in my life. Doubt he was. They looked from one to the other. Well, where was it you run up on him? I never laid eyes on the man before today. Never even heard of him. He raised his glass and drank. There was a strange silence in the room. The men looked like mud effigies. Finally, someone began to laugh. Then another. Soon they were all laughing together. Someone bought the judge a drink. So what's really interesting here is that the judge just completely lied. He came in there, again, spoke in this really articulate, charismatic manner, convinced the entire crowd to attack this reverend, and it turns out it was all just bullshit. And so this really starts to give us a sense for the judge's character. He's seemingly just doing this for fun. He's an agent of chaos. He sows distrust and lies and manipulates people because he enjoys it. He very much is like a trickster figure, disturbing the peace and the order, especially since, this happened during a sermon and was done against a man of God. He seems to be someone who just sows disorder wherever he goes. And he does so by being just so silver-tongued, able to convince people just through his articulate manner of speech. We'll get more into the judge's character later on because it's like a really essential part of the book. But I also do want to discuss one of the main themes of the book as I view it, which is about how messed up and how evil humans are. Like humans are an especially strange and deranged sort of being. And not only that, but the entire world is messed up. We inhabit this very, very dark place. And if you examine some of the corners of this earth, you would be forced to kind of agree that there's something very, very messed up taking place on this rock. I think this is exemplified when the kid he meets this somewhat perverted hermit who has this to say to him: "A man's at odds to know his mind, cause his mind is aught he has to know it with. He can know his heart, but he don't want to. Rightly so. Best not look in there. It ain't the heart of a creature that is bound in the way that God has set for it. You can find meanness in the least of creatures. But when God made man, the devil was at his elbow. A creature that can do anything. Make a machine, and a machine to make the machine, and evil that can run itself 1,000 years, no need to tend it." So this really illuminates that crucial theme of humans being especially evil. You know, when God made us, the devil was at his elbow. Like something inherently dark was put into our substance. And even this is just a great piece of writing with so many ideas being conveyed, especially at the beginning when he says that a man's at odds to know his mind because his mind is aught he has to know it with. We use consciousness to understand the world, but because we use consciousness, it makes it hard for us to understand consciousness because we need to use consciousness to understand it. And beyond that, it's giving this sense that like there's something wrong with humans, that we are like these failed beings. And the book is deeply cynical about human nature. And to be totally fair, this book feels like a very honest look at humanity and the dark side of humanity, like how deranged we can really be, which is pretty clear if one looks at history, and especially what happens during war. War turns people into these very dark, malicious, evil beings, where they give up morality and just maraud and do whatever they want because they have power. And so humans are like these beings that have strayed so far from what God originally intended. But not only that, the entire world seems to be constituted thusly. The book wants you to know that we inhabit this very evil world, and this place is some kind of fevered dream, some kind of nightmare. Now, another theme of the book is violence, the nature of violence, and what sort of a thing violence is. Especially how common violence used to be in the past. Like, war used to be so much more common than it is today, where there basically wasn't a year where there wasn't some sort of war taking place somewhere on the earth. And it really examined what causes men to choose violence. We touched on the historical setting of the book, which is the southwestern United States right after the Mexican War, or Mexican-American War. And this historical setting really comes to life in the book. Every aspect of life in those times is described in astonishing detail, from the way they reload their weapons, to the way they take care of their animals, to the sorts of settlements they live in. Like the amount of research that would have had to gone into understanding the time period and the nature of the time period, the way the animals are described, the way the plants are described in details. It's like an inconceivable amount of research went into this book to make sure it was historically accurate and really transporting you to the time period. So the kid is recruited by some soldiers who want to continue the invasion of Mexico. Even though the war is over, they're planning to invade again, just to, do whatever they want and steal some more land. And listen to what the captain says while trying to give the kid a reason to join up with them. The captain leaned forward. "We fought for it, lost friends and brothers down there, and then by God if we didn't give it back. Back to a bunch of barbarians that even the most biased in their favor will admit have no least notion in God's earth of honor or justice or the meaning of republican government. A people so cowardly, they've paid tribute 100 years to tribes of naked savages, given up their crops and livestock, mines shut down, whole villages abandoned, while a heathen horde rides over the land, looting and killing with total impunity. Not a hand raised against them. What kind of people are these? The Apaches won't even shoot them. Did you know that? They kill them with rocks." The captain shook his head. He seemed made sad by what he had to tell. "What we are dealing with," he said, "is a race of degenerates, a mongrel race, little better than niggers, and maybe no better yet. There is no government in Mexico. Hell, there's no God in Mexico. Never will be. We are dealing with a people manifestly incapable of governing themselves. And do you know what happens with people who cannot govern themselves? That's right. Others come in to govern for them. So here, this soldier who's planning to invade Mexico again is talking up the racist rhetoric, depicting the Mexicans as barbarians, which is a pretty common thing to justify, such excursions that are aimed at killing them. This dehumanization is often the preface for war. The less you see your enemies as human, the easier it is for you to kill them. And these are really common justifications for violence, perhaps even necessary justifications for violence, because if you see your enemies as human, it's harder to justify killing them. The more you dehumanize them, the easier that task becomes. And this book is really trying to depict the extreme racism that used to exist in the past. Like, there was a time when racism was just extremely overt. And at this point in history, slavery hadn't been abolished. But in the past, people were just far more racist than they were today, overtly, completely overtly. And if you aren't a careful reader, it might be easy to conclude that the book itself is also racist. But that's clearly not the case. The characters are extremely racist, but the book seems to depict all humans as being particularly evil, that there's something wrong with everyone, that humans in general are just like this demonic race upon the face of the earth. Especially the main characters, especially the Glanton gang who we meet later. They're depicted as like the worst sort of men you could ever encounter. So the kid, for some reason, agrees to this and is recruited. And they set off towards Mexico. And now this book contains a lot of scenes where nothing is happening, but characters are walking from point A to point B, which sounds really boring. And yet these scenes were often my favorite. These were often the scenes that I found the most engrossing, which really shows the skill of McCarthy's writing. Because McCarthy somehow finds a way to make every image just drip with symbolism and metaphor, all in service to setting the theme of just utter darkness and evil. Every little thing in nature can be this window into a deeper metaphorical understanding about the world at large. And from these descriptions, you get the impression that the characters themselves are just walking into hell, and that there's nothing but death and misery and evil omens upon the road that they traverse. It all feels so ominous, and it clearly serves as a warning for the evil that's yet to come. And so I want to look at some examples of this. I think one of the early ones is this paragraph. They rode on, and the sun in the east flushed pale streaks of light, and then a deeper run of color, like blood seeping up in sudden reaches, flaring planewise, and where the earth drained up into the sky at the edge of creation, the top of the sun rose out of nothing, like the head of a great red phallus, until it cleared the unseen rim, and sat squat and pulsing and malevolent behind them. The shadows of the smallest stones lay like pencil lines across the sand, and the shapes of the men and their mounts advanced elongate before them, like strands of the night from which they'd ridden, like tentacles to bind them to the darkness yet to come. So yeah, you get this sense that something very dark and evil is brewing, like they are walking into hell and the absolute night. It's so well written, and it just makes me wonder about the mind that came up with them. Like, it's utter genius, and I think that's one of the cool things about book as well, is that it's a window into someone's mind. And what puzzles me is that if McCarthy is such a good writer and is able to write these beautiful sentences, why is he writing about this? Like, he's writing about utter depravity, which makes me think that there's something important to ponder about the nature of violence and evil. Like, we need to pay attention to it, and it deserves this sort of a treatment. Here's another example. All night sheet lightning quaked sourceless to the west, beyond the midnight thunderheads, making a bluish day of the distant desert. The mountains on the sudden skyline stark and black and livid, like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone but fear. The thunder moved up from the southwest, and lightning lit the desert all about them. Blue and barren, great clanging reaches ordered out of the absolute night, like some demon kingdom summoned up, or changeling land, that come the day would leave them neither trace, nor smoke, nor ruin, more than any troubling dream. So we have more imagery invoking these ideas of like demon kingdoms. Like, the geology itself is imbued with the evil that lives inside the characters. Every once in a while, I would be reading the book and come across a paragraph like this and just pause to study it and read it multiple times and then just sit there in awe at like the beauty of the writing. I want to go through a few more examples of this. For example, this one. The jagged mountains were pure blue in the dawn, and everywhere birds twittered, and the sun when it rose caught the moon in the west, so that they lay opposed to each other across the earth, the sun white hot and the moon a pale replica, as if they were the ends of a common bore, beyond whose terminals burned worlds past all reckoning. Like, what? Like this is an example of one of the things that I read where I just had to stop and just gawk at it and just wonder about the mind that came out like that came up with something like this. And you can see how McCarthy takes elements of the world and puts them together to create these powerful metaphors. Every little aspect of nature gets turned into something profound and significant. And it just makes these scenes that involve nothing but walking so entertaining. McCarthy also wants to invoke the sense that nature itself is evil or perilous or dangerous. And it's not just other humans that are looking to spill blood, but nature herself at every opportunity. I think this is a great paragraph that illustrates this. Far out on the desert to the north, dust spouts rose, wobbling, and augured the earth, and some said they'd heard of pilgrims borne aloft like dervishes in those mindless coils, to be dropped broken and bleeding upon the desert again, and there perhaps to watch the thing that had destroyed them lurch onward like some drunken djinn, and resolve itself once more into the elements from which it sprang. Out of that whirlwind no voice spoke, and the pilgrim lying in his broken bones may cry out, and in his anguish he may rage. But rage at what? And if the dried and blackened shell of him is found among the sands by travelers to come yet, who can discover the engine of his ruin? I really love that one. It's just such a cool use of words. And throughout the book, there are so many words where I actually had to go to the dictionary, as in Google, to learn the meaning. And so the vocabulary is immense. And not only that, but the parts of the book are in Spanish. And so you need to know a little bit of Spanish to read through them. And there's this sense of maturity. Like, yeah, like some of the sentences are a little bit hard to decipher. But McCarthy trusts the reader to understand what is going on and to make meaning of it. And that's something I want to say as well, is that like I'm giving you my interpretation of this book, but it's really, given the fact that it's a novel, it's something for you to interpret as well. I recommend, everybody who watches this video also read the book because there's just so much incredible writing that I couldn't include in this video. I'm trying to include the highlights here. But there's so much to think about and so much to interpret, and so much room for interpretation. That's one of the great reasons why I often consider novels to be superior to nonfiction. Fiction is superior to nonfiction. Just because it's this opportunity to weave together ideas and metaphors and to leave the door open for interpretation. So let's continue with the story. So as the kid rides with this ragtag team of marauders, they encounter a massive flock of livestock being herded by some Comanche. And they're expecting an easy fight because they have guns while the Comanche have bows and arrows. But then it quickly turns into a bloodbath. And in a single very long sentence, he describes a scene of utter horror as the culmination of this reckless pursuit into the desert. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and the horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque, with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue, and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke, like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools. So that's just incredible, utterly horrifying, and just like the level of detail being used to describe the Comanche, it just makes them feel so real and so present, while also seeming like beings from another world entirely. It instills absolute terror, and the sense that this country is just wild and barbarous and there are things out there you best not encounter. But it also just has so much history and so much character and makes the scene really come alive, the way he describes the way they're dressed, the fact that one of them is wearing the armor of a Spanish conquistador. And so the company is attacked, and this is where an extremely violent scene ensues. Now driving in a wild frieze of headlong horses with eyes walled and teeth cropped, and naked riders with clusters of arrows clenched in their jaws and their shields winking in the dust, and up the far side of the ruined ranks in a piping of bone flutes, and dropping down off the sides of their mounts with one heel hung in the wither's strap, and their short bows flexing beneath the outstretched necks of the ponies, until they had circled the company and cut their ranks in two, and then rising up again like funhouse figures, some with nightmare faces painted on their breasts, riding down the unhorsed Saxons, and spearing and clubbing them, and leaping from their mounts with knives, and running about the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot, like creatures driven to alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead, and seizing them up by the hair, and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike, and snatching aloft the bloody wigs, and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals, some of the savages so slathered up with gore that they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some who fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. So yeah, you can see that this is extremely bloody, gory, and violent, and it really sets the tone for what is to come. It makes it clear that the kid's journey is one of complete and utter mayhem. It's extremely dangerous, and nothing good will come of it. This very long sentence, and that's a feature of the book as well, like sentences that are really, really long, using the word and to keep things together. It also gives us our first instance of scalping, which is when you would remove the scalp of the dead to keep as a trophy or as evidence that you had killed them. And I think this is what the title of the book, Blood Meridian, is referring to. The bloody scalps, which the gang later on is so committed to collecting in vast quantities. Now, this frenzied bloodlust, which the Comanche indulge in, it might give you the sense that the Comanche are the villains of this book. But actually, it becomes clear later on that there are no heroes of this book or no good guys. There are some characters that are good, and arguably by the end, there's something redeeming about the kid himself. But for the most part, every man depicted in this book is just pure evil, and especially the main characters. The point being that there's something evil about all humans in general. And I also want to talk about the native representation in this book, because it's just so historically accurate. There are so many different native tribes depicted, and they have different relationships to the white people. Some are more engaged with white civilization, while others are living entirely in the wild. And there are so many different groups. There are Comanche, Apache, Yumas, Delawares, and many, many more. And again, while the characters of the book are extremely racist, the book itself is not. And it is just trying to depict with honesty the extreme racism that existed in the past. So, despite this slaughter, the kid manages to survive, and he makes it to a Mexican town where he's immediately arrested. Along the way, he's accompanied by this man named Sproul, who suffers agonizingly the entire time. And it's actually really brutal to hear how this man is suffering. He's dying slowly from this maggot-infested wound. At one point, he's attacked by a vampire bat. And his whole experience just reinforces the notion that we live in some kind of a hellish realm if humans are subject to this sort of thing. So while the kid is imprisoned in a Mexican town, he finally encounters the Glanton gang, ride through, and they are described as the sort of men you would never ever want to encounter. And with them is the judge. Now, these men are scalp hunters. They're paid to collect the scalps of Native Americans that they've slain. In other words, their job is genocide, and they clearly love it, and they don't seem to want to stop doing it. But look at how they're described. They saw one day a pack of vicious-looking humans mounted on unshod Indian ponies, riding half-drunk through the streets, bearded, barbarous, clad in the skins of animals stitched up with thews, and armed with weapons of every description, revolvers of enormous weight, and bowie knives the size of claymores, and short two-barreled rifles with bores you could stick your thumbs in, and the trappings of the horses fashioned out of human skin, and their bridles woven up from human hair, and decorated with human teeth, and the riders wearing scapulars or necklaces of dried and blackened human ears, and the horses raw-looking and wild in the eye, and their teeth bared like feral dogs, and riding also in the company a number of half-naked savages, reeling in the saddle, dangerous, filthy, brutal, the whole like a visitation from some heathen land where they and others like them fed on human flesh. And again, riding with them is the judge. We see him again for the second or third time. Foremost among them, outsized and childlike, with his naked face, rode the judge. His cheeks were ruddy, and he was smiling and bowing to the ladies and doffing his filthy hat. The enormous dome of his head, when he bared it, was blinding white and perfectly circumscribed about so that it looked to have been painted. He and his reeking horde of rabble with him passed on through the stunted streets and hove up before the governor's palace, where their leader, a small black-haired man, clapped for entrance by kicking at the oaken doors with his boot. So it's important to note that these men are just utter barbarians. But with them is the judge. And remember, the judge is this enormous man with absolutely no hair on his body. He's completely bald to the point where it's kind of like he's this enormous infant. And I think that imagery is actually telling. There is something childlike about him. Like he's this little kid just having the best time. And all that he's doing for fun. Another important character is Glanton, the gang's leader. And while the judge is the largest person in this company, it's actually led by another man named Glanton, who himself is this brutal, ruthless, relentless man who seems driven to just kill as many people as possible. The next scene gives us some insight into the judge's character and what sort of a person he is. This is a scene where the gang are acquiring new pistols. Glanton, he decides to test the pistols out by shooting every animal within eyesight. Because of this, they get into a dispute with the local authorities, and as a confrontation brews, the judge steps in. The sergeant stepped forward and assumed a posture of authority. Glanton spat. The judge had already crossed the space between them, and now he took the sergeant aside and fell to conversing with him. The sergeant came to his armpit, and the judge spoke warmly and gestured with a great expansiveness of spirit. The soldiers squatted in the dust with their muskets and regarded the judge without expression. He then, for some reason, starts to give a lecture to the sergeant about Black Jackson. Black Jackson, or just Jackson, is a member of the gang, a black man. And he has this whole storyline involving this other man named Jackson, which I'm not going to be including in this lecture, but more reason to read the book yourself. But anyways, the judge goes on. That dark, vexed face. He studied it and drew the sergeant forward, the better for him to observe, and then he began a laborious introduction in Spanish. He sketched for the sergeant a problematic career of the man before them, his hands drafting with a marvelous dexterity, the shapes of what varied paths conspired here in the ultimate authority of the extants. He told them, like strings drawn together through the eye of a ring. He adduced for their consideration references to the children of Ham, the lost tribe of Israelites, certain passages from the Greek poets, anthropological speculations as to the propagation of the races in their dispersion and isolation through the agency of geological cataclysm, and an assessment of racial traits with respect to climatic and geographical influences. So this is where we start to see that alongside his very convincing manner of speech and the fluid articulacy, the judge is equipped with a vast amount of knowledge. I mean, sounds like some of it is pseudoscientific, but he's able to give these advanced lectures on topics and make the Black Man Jackson seem like this relic from another world. And he's doing so to impress this sergeant, as well as to mend things and to calm nerves between the gang and the sergeant. And so we have to ask the question of like why the judge is so smart and why he knows so much. Jackson demands to know what the judge told the sergeant because he told it to him in Spanish. This is the judge's reply. It is not necessary, he said, that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history, with or without their understanding. But it is consistent with notions of right principle that these facts, to the extent that they can be readily made to do so, should find a repository in the witness of some third party. Sergeant Aguilar is such a party, and any slight to his office is but a secondary consideration when compared to divergences in that larger protocol exacted by the formal agenda of an absolute destiny. Words are things. The words he is in possession of he cannot be deprived of. Their authority transcends his ignorance of their meaning. Like, what? He just speaks so poetically, and yet what he's saying is actually really hard to decipher, perhaps deliberately. And you get this sense throughout the entire book that the gang barely understands a word that he's saying, and yet they feel so enchanted by the manner of his speech that they can't help but stand there in trance at his every utterance. And his long-winded monologues become a consistent feature of the book. We could also analyze a little bit of what's being said here, which is that, the judge is trying to maintain peace between these two parties and is claiming that Sergeant Aguilar can be some sort of a witness to what's about to take place. And the idea of a witness is a kind of common theme throughout the book, not one that I'm going to be touching on too much. But it's often claimed, for example, that can you say something really occurred if there were no witnesses to see it? And it's those sorts of themes which I think the judge is trying to explain here. So the gang begins their travels, traveling for a while, eventually finding their first victim, this harmless old woman who Glanton kills ruthlessly. The woman looked up. Neither courage nor heart sank in those old eyes. He pointed with his left hand, and she turned to follow his hand with her gaze, and he put the pistol to her head and fired. The explosion filled all that sad little park. Some of their horses shied and stepped. A fist-sized hole erupted out of the far side of the woman's head in a great vomit of gore, and she pitched over, and lay slain in her blood without remedy. Glanton had already put the pistol at half cock, and he flicked away the spent primer with his thumb, and was preparing to recharge the cylinder. "McGill," he said, a Mexican, solitary of his race in that company, came forward. "Get that receipt for us." He took a skinning knife from his belt and stepped to where the old woman lay, and took up her hair and twisted it about his wrist, and passed the blade of the knife about her skull and ripped away the scalp. So this murder seems to be nothing out of the ordinary for this company. This seems to be just like an innocent old woman. She's not hurting anybody. And yet for them, death is as casual as snacking. They are completely ruthless. And remember, they're driven by money. That's why the scalp is collected. And what I love as well is that most of the characters in the book, other than the judge and other than another character named the ex-priest Tobin, they say very, very little. And yet, by what little they say, they end up saying so much. McCarthy somehow knows how to use many words, but then also how to be sparing with your words and just say a little bit. And by that little bit you say, somehow convey so much. The kid, for example, he barely speaks throughout the entire book. And yet, just the few things that he says, it conveys so much character. Now, even though this party is intent on killing as many Indians as possible, and I'm going to be referring to them as Indians because that's often how they refer to themselves, even today, it isn't that simple where it's like white men versus Indians. And in fact, in the company are several Indian men belonging to an entirely different tribe called the Delawares from the eastern United States. And these men are some of the most brutal in the company. They seem to be the trackers. And the native representation in this book is just so attuned to the historical realities. It's really easy to think about Native Americans as being very monolithic. But the reality is that not all native tribes were friends with each other. Many of them were actually enemies. And throughout the book, there are natives depicted as barbaric savages, like the Comanche, but then there are others who are depicted as kind and caring. It really covers the full spectrum that exists in the world, apart from our small-minded assumptions. But I really love this passage, which describes the Delawares. They were men of another time, for all that they bore Christian names, and they had lived all their lives in a wilderness, as had their fathers before them. They learnt war by warring, the generations driven from the eastern shore across a continent, from the ashes at Nadenhutton onto the prairies, and across the outlet to the bloodlands of the west. If much in the world were mystery, the limits of that world were not, for it was without measure or bound, and there were contained within it creatures more horrible yet, and men of other colors, and beings which no man has looked upon, and yet not alien none of it more than were their own hearts alien in them, whatever wilderness contained there, and whatever beasts. Like, it's just so cool. And it's also serving that theme of this place, whatever it is, and all the life here, being just mysterious and strange and eerie and dangerous and horrifying. McCarthy, through this book and through the circumstances of what takes place in the plot, is really trying to convey the idea that all of this is really terrifying. It's all just strange and mysterious, and we don't really pay enough mind to how strange existence really is. And throughout the book, there are so many images which are just nightmarish and unpleasant. There's a tree with dead babies. I don't think I need to explain why that's so messed up. And much later in the book, when the company encounters a bunch of crazed gold prospectors who've barricaded themselves from Indian attacks, one of their horses is snake bit and described like this. They had but two animals, and one of these had been snake bit in the desert, and this thing now stood in the compound with its head enormously swollen and grotesque, like some fabled equine ideation out of an Attic tragedy. It had been bitten on the nose, and its eyes bulged out of the shapeless head in a horror of agony, and it tottered moaning toward the clustered horses of the company, with its long misshapen muzzle swinging and drooling, and its breath wheezing in the throttled pipes of its throat. The skin had split along the bridge of its nose, and the bone shone through pinkish white, and its small ears looked like paper spills, twisted into either side of a hairy loaf of dough. The American horses began to mill and separate along the wall at its approach, and it swung after them blindly. There was a flurry of thumps and kicks, and the horses began to circle the compound. A small mottled stallion belonging to one of the Delawares came out of the remuda and struck at the thing twice, and then turned and buried its teeth into its neck. Out of the mad horse's throat came a sound that brought the men to the door. "Why don't you shoot that thing?" said Irving. "Sooner it dies, sooner it'll rot," they said. Irving spat. "You aim to eat it and it's snake bit?" They looked at one another. They didn't know. So it's images like this that convey the notion of existence being this horrible place to inhabit. And while at the mines, the judge takes this opportunity to explore his scientific curiosities. They posted guards atop the azotea and unsaddled the horses and drove them out to graze, and the judge took one of the pack animals and emptied out the panniers and went off to explore the works. In the afternoon, he sat in the compound breaking ore samples with a hammer, the feldspar rich in red oxide of copper, and native nuggets in whose organic libations he purported to read news of the Earth's origins, holding an extemporary lecture in geology to a small gathering who nodded and spat. A few would quote him scripture to confound his ordering up of eons out of the ancient chaos and other apostate supposings. The judge smiled. "Books lie," he said. "God don't lie." "No," said the judge, "he does not, and these are his words." He held up a chunk of rock. "He speaks in stones and trees, the bones of things." The squatters in their rags nodded among themselves, and were soon reckoning him correct, this man of learning, in all his speculations, and this the judge encouraged, until they were right proselytes of the new order, whereupon he laughed at them for fools. So again, we get this impression of the judge being a man of science, and has this deep desire to unravel the mysteries of the world, while at the same time speaking in such a manner that anybody who listens to him is also convinced of his notions. And again, the question is why? Why is he so interested in science? Why is he so well educated? And it's a question I'm going to be answering as we continue to examine the judge's character. Now, the next chapter is my favorite in the book, which is simply Tobin, who's a member of the company, who is known as the ex-priest. He's regaling to the kid the story of how the judge found the company and saved them from slaughter. They were completely without powder and had no ammunition to fight off the enemy. The enemy in this case being, I think, some Comanche or some Apache that are following them. And he explains how the judge is seemingly supernaturally gifted. He can speak many languages and is skilled in every which way and knowledgeable about every subject. As he says, the gifts of the Almighty are weighed and parceled out in a scale peculiar to himself. It's no fair accounting, and I don't doubt but what he'd be the first to admit it, and you put the query to him boldface. Who? The Almighty, the Almighty. The ex-priest shook his head. He glanced across the fire toward the judge. That great hairless thing. You wouldn't think to look at him that he could outdance the devil himself, now would ye? God, the man is a dancer. You'll not take that away from him. And fiddle. He's the greatest fiddler I ever heard, and that's an end on it. The greatest. He can cut a trail, shoot a rifle, ride a horse, track a deer. He's been all over the world. Him and the governor, they sat up till breakfast, and it was Paris this and London that in 5 languages. You'd have give something to have heard them. The governor's a learned man himself, he is, but the judge... The ex-priest shook his head. Oh, it may be the Lord's way of showing how little store he sets by the learned. Whatever could it mean to one who knows all? He's an uncommon love for the common man, and godly wisdom resides in the least of things, so that it may well be that the voice of the Almighty speaks most profoundly in such beings as live in silence themselves. So we learn that the judge is special. He's super educated. He seems to be good at every skill. And Tobin goes on to explain how, during this desperate situation, with no gunpowder, being pursued by the Apache, the judge seemingly finds them randomly. Then about the meridian of that day, we come upon the judge on his rock, there in that wilderness by his single self. Aye, and there was no rock, just the one. Irving said he'd brung it with him. I said that it was a mere stone, for to mark him out of nothing at all. He had with him that self-same rifle you see with him now. all mounted in German silver, and the name that he'd given it set with silver wire under the check piece in Latin, Et in Arcadia ego, a reference to the lethal in it, common enough for a man to name his gun. And so we're starting to get the sense that while the judge is very special, there's something really weird about him, something supernatural. And it becomes more and more evident that he is some sort of a supernatural being. And even the inscription on his rifle, Et in Arcadia ego, it translates to something like, even in Arcadia, there I am, conveying a sense in which you can't ever escape the judge. Even at the end of time, he'll be there. But he appears before the company in their hour of desperation, and just seems so thrilled to have encountered them there. Glanton just studied him. It was a day's work to even guess what he made of that figure on the ground. I don't know to this day. They've a secret commerce, some terrible covenant. You mind, you'll see I'm right. He called for the last of the 2 pack animals we had, and he cut the straps and left the wallets to lay where they fell, and the judge mounted up and he and Glanton rode side by side, and soon they was conversing like brothers. The judge sat that animal bareback like an Indian, and rode with his grip and his rifle perched on the withers, and he looked about him with the greatest satisfaction in the world, as if everything had turned out just as he had planned, and the day could not have been finer. So the judge is just utterly thrilled to now be involved with this company. And there are so many hints of the judge being like a supernatural entity, but not really like a god, more like a demon. I've seen some comparisons to the devil, that like the judge is supposed to represent the devil. And my reaction to that is like, this man is way more evil than the devil. And it seems like his purpose in all of this is to guide people towards more violence. That seems to be what this secret commerce or this terrible covenant is all about. The judge will be involved with this company so long as they continue the bloodshed to the maximum extent. You also get the sense that all of the calamitous events of the book are being orchestrated by the judge. And the judge seems to be like this voice in Glanton's mind, urging him towards the path of maximum bloodshed. And he treats war like it's fun, like it's some fun high-stakes game that he wants to win. And that's the sense that you get from the judge, that all of this is just to have a good time. So the judge basically takes command of this company, although, Glanton is officially the one in charge, and he leads them towards some mountains. And in this incredible sequence, they avoid the Indians while also gathering up all the necessary ingredients to make gunpowder from scratch, and as well as to build everything they need to process it into usable powder for their weapons. His vast knowledge of the terrain and his scientific knowledge are being used to win this fight against the Indians, which for the judge just seems like this thrilling, fun game. And the whole time while this is happening, he's pausing to give these epic sermons, all while the Indians are in pursuit. Beyond the Malpais was a volcanic peak, and in the sunrise it was many colors, and there was little dark birds crossing down the wind, and the wind was flapping the judge's old Benjamin about him, and he pointed to that stark and solitary mountain, and delivered himself of an oration, to what end I know not, then or now, and he concluded with the telling us that our mother the earth, as he said, was round like an egg, and contained all good things within her. Then he turned and led the horse he had been riding across that terrain of black and glassy slag, treacherous to man and beast alike, and us behind him like the disciples of a new faith. And to my understanding, this entire chapter is an allusion to Paradise Lost, and the devil in Paradise Lost. I believe there's a scene where he makes gunpowder, and he teaches the other demons how to make gunpowder. And yes, while the judge is there to save them, so to speak, he's leading them further and further into hell. And that seems to be his primary motivation, to take men on this journey to the utterly darkest corners of existence. So they go to this volcanic peak, which feels very hellish, as Tobin describes it, the Malpais. It was a maze. Ye'd run out upon a little promontory, and ye'd be balked about by the steep crevasses. You wouldn't dare to jump them. Sharp black glass the edges, and sharp the flinty rocks below. We led the horses with every care, and still they were bleeding about their hooves. Our boots was cut to pieces. Clambering over those old caved and crumpled plates, you could see well enough how things had gone in that place. Rocks melted and set up all wrinkled, like a pudding. The earth stove through to the molten core of her, where for aught any man knows lies the locality of hell. For the earth is a globe in the void, and truth there's no up nor down to it, and there's men in this company besides myself seen little cloven hoof prints in the stone, clever as a little doe in her going, but what little doe ever trod melted rock? I'd not go behind scripture, but it may be that there has been sinners so notorious evil that the fires coughed them up again. And I could well see in the long ago how it was little devils with their pitchforks had traversed that fiery vomit for to salvage back those souls that had by misadventure been spewed up from their damnation onto the outer shelves of the world. Aye, it's a notion no more, but some place in the scheme of things, this world must touch the other, and something put them little hooflet marks in the lava flow, for I seen them there myself. And it's in this hellish landscape so beautifully described, which is speculated by Tobin to be the very entrance of hell, where the judge gets the final ingredients for the gunpowder, in this case some sulfur from the brimstone. And he puts them all together before ordering everyone in the company to start pissing furiously into the powder, to supply the needed ammonia while he worked it up, laughing all the while like this whole situation was hilarious to him. Meanwhile, the Indians have spotted them and are racing up the hill to reach them, assuming them to be entirely without powder. And the judge test fires the powder before baiting the Indians into an attack. And so as they race up the hill, expecting an easy victory, the company unleashes their volleys and slaughters them all. And so why did the judge do all of this? He is using his expertise and his supreme intelligence not for something productive like curing cancer, but to kill, but to engage in war and blood. He seems to be there for the promotion of war, as though there is no greater thrill in the world than to kill others and convince others to do the same. And so the vast corpus of scientific knowledge which the judge is in possession of, it serves the purpose of being better at killing. It really is a matter for him of dominating other men. That's why he's so educated. That's why he's so scientific and constantly trying to learn more about the world. It's all so that he can dominate, and so that he can kill as he pleases. There's also this eerie moment, which I didn't include in my slides, where the kid, after listening to all of this, asks the priest, what is he a judge of? The priest is like, what's he a judge of? What's he a judge of? And then the priest basically warns him, like, don't ask that question. He can hear us. So there's something really creepy going on with the judge, which I think becomes exemplified really greatly, especially towards the ending. Now, a little later on, there's a night where, after taking some sketches of historical artifacts, the judge tells a story. Now, the story itself is quite lengthy, and so even though it's really good, I won't include the entire thing here. But to summarize it, it basically involves this harness maker murdering a kind traveler and then lying about it. And from there, the judge explains. There was a young bride waiting for that traveler with whose bones we are acquainted, and she bore a child in her womb that was the traveler's son. Now this son, whose father's existence in this world is historical and speculative even before the son has entered it, is in a bad way. All his life he carries before him the idol of a perfection to which he can never attain. The father dead has euchred the son out of his patrimony, for it is the death of the father to which the son is entitled, and to which he is heir, more so than his goods. He will not hear of the small mean ways that tempered the man in life. He will not see him struggling in follies of his own devising. No, the world which he inherits bears him false witness. He is broken before a frozen god, and he will never find his way. Now, this is an interesting monologue. For me, it speaks very much to the nature of the father archetype and the sense of preservation, which is a key feature of masculinity. The father passes on everything to the son, passes on his knowledge, passes on his understanding of the world, also passes on the sense in which he is a mortal being, right? And so the son, if he doesn't know his dad, is free to think of his dad almost like this divine being, because he will never see him struggle in follies of his own devising, from which he can learn and figure out his own path. But the father passes on everything to the son, thereby preserving it for the next generation. And so the son, if he has a father, does not need to start from scratch. But without the father, the son will be lost in the world, disconnected from his heritage. Interesting as well that the judge claims that the son is entitled to the death of the father, as though the death of the father marks the entrance of the son into manhood, where he must take up the mantle, as he can no longer rely on his father. And so, even not being able to witness the death of the father has set up the son for a bad fate. Now, this scene is actually taking place near the ruins of an ancient Native American civilization who are called the Anasazi. And again, another example of Native representation, but also like historical Native representation, because these are natives that are no longer around, having built these cool stone structures, which is rather different from the other Indians whose buildings are not as permanent. And this becomes a cool metaphor for what the judge says next. What is true of one man, said the judge, is true of many. The people who once lived here are called the Anasazi, the old ones. They quit these parts, routed by drought or diseased or by wandering bands of marauders, quit these parts ages since, and of them there is no memory. They are rumors and ghosts in this land, and they are much revered. The tools, the art, the building, these things stand in judgment on the latter races. Yet there is nothing for them to grapple with. The old ones are gone, like phantoms, and the savages wander these canyons to the sound of an ancient laughter. In their crude huts, they crouch in darkness and listen to the fear seeping out of the rock. All progressions from a higher to a lower order are marked by ruins and mystery and a residue of nameless rage. So, here are the dead fathers. Their spirit is entombed in the stone. It lies upon the land with the same weight and the same ubiquity. For whoever makes a shelter of reeds and hides has joined his spirit to the common destiny of creatures, and he will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry. But who builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe, and so it was with these masons, however primitive their works may seem to us. And so the sense in which these buildings created by the Anasazi still stand and still endure, this is also echoed in that theme of the father archetype, that sense in which whatever is built out of stone is preserved so as to maintain order. Because whoever builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe, whereas those creatures who build shelter from reeds and hides will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry. Their impact upon the universe is not noted. But those who build in stone, who build permanent structures, more in line with the masculine notion of preserving, they are the ones who successfully stake their claim in the world. So some really interesting ideas, some really interesting archetypal ideas. And that's why he refers to the Anasazi as the dead fathers. Their influence upon the land can still be felt. And he goes on in his speech to say this: if God meant to interfere in the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? Wolves call themselves man. What other creature could? And is the race of man not more predacious yet? The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die, but in the affairs of men there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening and the evening of his day. He loves games? Let him play for stakes. This you see here, these ruins wondered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again? Aye, and again, with other people, with other sons. So there's a lot going on here and a lot of interesting ideas and metaphorical notions being used. But the thing that I want to focus on is that sense of the degeneracy of mankind. If God meant to interfere with it, would he not have done so by now? It's another circling back to the theme of humans being these failed beings, being particularly evil and degenerate. Like there's something very wrong with us. And we seem to be restlessly striving towards an uncertain path. So throughout the book, the judge is seen writing in his notebook, making sketches of artifacts before destroying them. So he keeps the sketches, but the actual artifacts are destroyed. And he makes drawings of animals and plants, and he's also collecting specimens. I think in particular, there's a scene in which he's collecting specimens of birds. And one of the company named Toadvine asks him what he is doing, and he says this: "Whatever exists," he said, "whatever in creation exists without my knowledge, exists without my consent. These anonymous creatures," he said, "may seem little or nothing in the world, yet the smallest crumb can devour us. Any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of men's knowing. Only nature can enslave man. And only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth." What's a suzerain? A keeper or overlord. Why not say keeper then? Because he is a special kind of keeper. A suzerain rules even where there are other rulers. His authority countermands local judgments. And so it seems that the judge's purpose in scientifically investigating the world is to control it. By understanding nature, he can rule over it. That's the reason for being so scientifically minded. He is obsessed with control and being the overlord over all creation. And from my perspective, it makes a lot of sense because what the judge is doing is becoming conscious of the world and understanding its inner mechanisms. And consciousness gives us power over the world. When we understand something, we effectively have power over it and can manipulate it towards our ends. And so by being conscious of everything that exists, one can effectively rule over all that exists and manipulate all entities in accordance with their own will. That's why he says, whatever exists in creation without my knowledge exists without my consent. As though he wants to be the sole entity that decides what takes place upon the face of the earth. The judge goes on. The judge placed his hands on the ground. He looked at his inquisitor. "This is my claim," he said. "And yet everywhere upon it are pockets of autonomous life. Autonomous. In order for it to be mine, nothing must be permitted to occur upon it save by my dispensation." Toadvine sat with his boots crossed before the fire. "No man can acquaint himself with everything on this earth," he said. The judge tilted his great head. "The man who believes that the secrets of the world are forever hidden lives in mystery and fear. Superstition will drag him down. The rain will erode the deeds of his life. But that man who sets himself the task of singling out of the thread of order from the tapestry will by the decision alone have taken charge of the world, and it is only by such taking charge that he will effect a way to dictate the terms of his own fate." I don't see what that has to do with catching birds. The freedom of birds is an insult to me. I'd have them all in zoos. So the judge just straight up claims that the entire world is his, and yet, so long as things proceed autonomously, he cannot claim to be the true ruler. And in case it isn't clear, the judge is a complete psychopath. He's sadistic, manipulative, and he wants to be able to rule over all living entities. And he believes himself to be the rightful ruler of the world, and that all events must be orchestrated by him. That's why he's attempting to understand the world, because he claims that whoever doesn't understand the world is effectively ruled by fate. It's when you have a scientific understanding of the mechanisms of existence that you're able to dictate the terms of your own fate. And this is effectively how he treats the Glanton gang, as instruments of his own devising, as he drives them further and further towards ruin. And there's something to say about psychopaths in general, who often want their own freedom. They're obsessed with freedom. They want the freedom to do whatever they want with whoever they want. They don't want freedom for other people. They want their own freedom. And there's something very left hemisphere about the judge and all that he represents, all the scientific knowledge and the way he talks and the way he uses speech as like one of his fundamental powers, and the way he's such a psychopath and it has no empathy at all for other beings. I didn't talk about this, but it's actually clear throughout the book, or hinted at throughout the book, that the judge is a serial child abuser. It's constantly hinted that he kidnaps children, does unspeakable things to them before murdering them. And so it's clear that he wants the freedom to do whatever he wants. And even something like child abuse is very much about power. It's about the power to rule over someone who has less power than you. And this is his reason for acquainting himself with the facts of the world. It speaks to how consciousness gives us free will or gives us power over the world. And it also shows that there's something very dark, potentially, about science. We often these days see science as like a liberator, or there's something very noble about scientific aspirations. But anybody who reads this book, as well as is familiar with things like Faust and the Faust myth in German literature, knows that science can actually be very, very dark. There can be something very messed up about trying to uncover the secrets of reality in a scientific way. Because to what end? It gives you power, but also the power to do horrible things, like the nuclear bomb. And it's worth thinking more about Glanton a little bit more, because Glanton feels very much like a stand-in for Ahab from Moby Dick. He drives his gang to the absolute ends of the earth, seeking more and more violence. And there's a great passage which discusses Glanton and reflects a little bit about what he's like. That night, Glanton stared long into the embers of the fire. All about him, his men were sleeping, but much was changed. So many gone, defected, or dead. The Delawares all slain. He watched the fire, and if he saw portents there, it was much the same to him. He would live to look upon the western sea, and he was equal to whatever might follow, for he was complete at every hour. Whether history should run concomitant with men and nations, whether it should cease, He'd long forsworn all weighing of consequence, and allowing as he did that men's destinies are given, yet he usurped to contain within him all that he would ever be in the world, and all that the world would be to him. And be his charter written in the earthstone itself, he claimed agency, and said so, and he'd driven the remorseless sun on to its final endarkenment, as if he'd ordered it all ages since, before there were paths anywhere, before there were men or suns to go upon them. Across from him sat the vast abhorrence of the judge. I really love this little bit here because you get the sense that it's Glanton who's driving this gang towards more and more bloodshed, towards more and more anarchy, not for any particular reason other than maybe that they enjoy it and that they enjoy the rewards of violence. With violence, you can just take whatever you want from people. I think that's actually what motivates a lot of like international violence, the sense that you can just go to another place and just take what belongs to other people. And yet, even that doesn't seem to be the ultimate aim of Glanton. It just seems to be violence for its own sake. And then while you're getting this impression of Glanton being the main agent of the events of the book, you get this passage of across from him sat the vast abhorrence of the judge, as though to remind us that no, it's really the judge who's orchestrating all of these events. He really is like this demon in Glanton's ear, driving him forward. And the violence which the gang lusts for reaches truly deranged levels. Look, for example, at this extremely violent massacre when the gang comes across a huge encampment of Heleños with women and children. When Glanton and his chiefs swung back through the village, people were running out under the horses' hooves, and the horses were plunging, and some of the men were moving on foot among the huts with torches and dragging the victims out, slathered and dripping with blood, hacking at the dying and decapitating those who knelt for mercy. There were in the camp a number of Mexican slaves, and these ran forth calling out in Spanish, and were brained or shot, and one of the Delawares emerged from the smoke with a naked infant dangling in each hand, and squatted at the ring of midden stones, and swung them by the heels each in turn, and bashed their heads against the stones, so that the brains burst forth through the fontanelle in a bloody spew, and humans on fire came shrieking forth like berserkers, and the riders hacked them down with their enormous knives, and a young woman ran up and embraced the bloodied forefeet of Glanton's warhorse. So the book is just extra grotesque with the violence, and not a single person is spared because they're paid for every single scalp. It's depicted as utterly nightmarish for the victims who are moaning and wailing and begging for their lives and desperately trying to escape. And yet, it's not any more violent than the historical reality. And I think that's really the point of the book. Like, the book isn't trying to depict like a new level of violence. It's trying to depict, with honesty, the violence that's taken place in the past. This very scene might have taken place because the Glanton gang was a real gang of scalp hunters in Mexico. It's likely that they massacred innocent civilians in this way. And yet that's a common feature of history. McCarthy is forcing us to reckon with the fact that violence is a part of what it means to be a human. And that reading history is reading a history of people trying to wipe each other out, killing and pillaging and looting and raping, and we seem to be an inherently violent species. Bloodshed is thoroughly soaked into what we are as an animal. This book chooses the era of American history as its setting, but it could have easily chosen thousands of other candidates, and you can imagine the judge being in any place attempting to produce as much carnage as possible. And the motivation for violence in this case is clear. The gang wants their scalps. They can also steal whatever they want from these Indians, as poor as they are. And the gang continues to ride searching for more victims, mercilessly massacring entire villages for their scalps. And it goes on and on to the point where it basically seems trivial, and the reader becomes numb to these horrid acts of violence. It just becomes completely normalized. And that seems to be something else that's taking place, is that the more violent these men become, the more casual killing becomes. It loses all meaning. The aftermath of one such attack is described like this. Long past that night, when the moon was already up, a party of women that had been upriver drying fish returned to the village and wandered howling through the ruins. A few fires still smoldered on the ground, and dogs slank off from among the corpses. An old woman knelt at the blackened stones before her, and poked brush into the coals and blew back a flame from the ashes, and began to right the overturned pots. All about her, the dead lay, with their peeled skulls like polyps bluely wet, or luminescent melons cooling on some mesa of the moon. In the days to come, the frail black rebuses of blood in those sands would crack and break and drift away, so that in the circuit of a few suns, all trace of the destruction of these people would be erased. The desert wind would salt their ruins, and there would be nothing, nor ghost nor scribe, to tell any pilgrim in his passing how it was that people had lived in this place and in this place died. And so it very much is this genocidal war being waged by the Scalp Hunters. They're trying to drive the Indians into extinction. And eventually, they start to kill everyone, not just the Indians, but Mexican civilians too, scalping them no differently and trying to pass their scalps off as Indian scalps. Eventually, this leads to several gunfights with Mexican soldiers. And at this point, the killing frenzy has just evolved into madness, and it seems like they are simply killing because they don't know what else to do. And eventually, the killing becomes so heinous that the state places a bounty for Glanton's head, and they become hunted. At some point, they're described like this. They looked bad. They were used up and bloody and black about the eyes, and they had bound up their wounds with linens that were filthy and blood-stained, and their clothes were crested with dried blood and powder black. Glanton's eyes in their sockets were burning centroids of murder, and he and his haggard riders stared balefully at the kid, as if he were no part of them, for all they were so alike in wretchedness of circumstance. And I think this is important to meditate upon because the price for violence is that it seems to offer violence in return. The more you kill, the more you slaughter, the more desperate people become to take revenge or simply to defend themselves. And so the immense violence inflicted by the gang upon these innocent civilians, they start to receive it in return. They are hunted down by the Mexican state, and many others just try to kill them. And so playing this game of violence is a dangerous game. Anybody who uses violence so casually should expect it in return. And it's clear that this sort of a life is miserable. And it's clear that this sort of a life is just miserable, and no one can get any rest. And yet for the judge, all of this is ideal. So the next thing I want to examine is my favorite monologue from the judge. This scene takes place around a campfire, and there's some sort of optical illusion, which is causing it to seem like there are two moons in the sky. The flames sawed in the wind, and the embers paled and paled and deepened, like the blood beat of some living thing eviscerate upon the ground before them, and they watched the fire which does contain within itself something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it, and are divided from their origins, and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, the first fire, and the last ever to be. By and by, the judge rose and moved away on some obscure mission, and after a while someone asked the ex-priest if it were true that at one time there had been two moons in the sky, and the ex-priest eyed the false moon above them, and said that it may well have been so. But certainly the wise high god, in his dismay at the proliferation of lunacy on this earth, must have whetted a thumb and leaned down out of the abyss and pinched it hissing into extinction. And could he find some alter means by which the birds could mend their paths in the darkness, he might have done with this one too. The question was then put as to whether there were on Mars or other planets in the void men or creatures like them, and at this the judge, who had returned to the fire and stood half naked and sweating, spoke, and said that there were not, and that there were no men anywhere in the universe save those upon the earth. All listened as he spoke, those who had turned to watch him and those who would not. The truth about the world, he said, is that anything is possible. Had you not seen it all from birth, and thereby bled of its strangeness, it would appear to you for what it is. A hat trick in a medicine show, a fevered dream, a trance bepopulate with chimeras, having neither analogue nor precedent, an itinerant carnival, a migratory tent show whose ultimate destination, after many a pitch in many a muddied field, is unspeakable and calamitous beyond reckoning. The universe is no narrow thing, and the order within it is not constrained by any latitude in its conception, to repeat what exists in one part in any other part. Even in this world, more things exist without our knowledge than with it, and the order in creation which you see is that which you have put there, like a string in a maze, so that you shall not lose your way. For existence has its own order, and that no man's mind can compass, that mind itself being but a fact among others. So we have some repetition of the theme of the proliferation of lunacy happening on the earth. Just like the things that take place upon this rock are totally crazy and humans are utterly mad, so much so that God has abandoned us. And then the judge seems to reveal something fundamental about this universe, which is, if one had the eyes to see it, it is utterly terrifying and unprecedented. The world is filled with inexplicable chimeras that boggle the mind, and all of this is headed towards further complexity, which our minds will likely never fully comprehend. It's like the more we understand, the more we realize how little we understand, and how utterly mind boggling all of this is. The only reason it seems ordinary is because we're in the midst of it, and we ourselves are these unprecedented chimerical beings. That's what he means when he said we've bled of its strangeness. And yet, if you take the time to just look around and examine reality, you just realize how utterly bizarre all of this is. Like, there are just beings spawning out of the mud. There are insects and animals and vicious carnivores mauling each other, and humans being amongst all of that. These conscious beings utterly different from everything else, capable of making the technology that we've made. And so the judge is giving this conception of reality being unconstrained. Anything is possible. Emergence keeps producing new types of phenomena, and it's utterly unconstrained. We don't know where all of this is headed. And in this world, more things exist without our knowledge than with it. He's giving this impression that the little that we know truly is so little, and that there's just so much more out there that our minds have yet to comprehend. The human mind itself also being this unprecedented phenomena taking place in this universe. And so he's really conveying the utter terror that reality consists of, that all of us seem to be oblivious to, largely as a consequence of the fact that we're used to it. This is the norm for us. But one can reach certain states of mind where everything feels fresh and new, and that's when it really dawns on you that this universe is just utterly bizarre. And in the judge's monologue, it's exemplified that all of this is meant to be terrifying. All of this is mind-boggling and hurts to attempt to comprehend and approach. But you could see it as in another way. You could see it all as beautiful, that the mystery of existence is beautiful. But aligned with the themes of the book, the judge presents it all as terrifying, which it undoubtedly is. So the judge has a few more monologues to give in the book, one of which is arguably the entire point of the book. But before I discuss that, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of my favorite writing that can be found throughout the book. Some more scenes of walking, where metaphors are weaved from the facts of nature. And this writing is not just beautiful, but also just ponders really fascinating philosophical ideas. Take this line, for example. They ate and moved on, leaving the fire on the ground behind them, and as they rode up into the mountains, this fire seemed to become altered of its location, now here, now there, drawing away or shifting unaccountably along the flank of their movement, like some ignis fatuus belated upon the road behind them, which all could see and of which none spoke. For this will to deceive that is in things luminous may manifest itself likewise in retrospect, and so by sleight of some fixed part of a journey already accomplished may also post amend to fraudulent destinies. Now, that's a rather perplexing sentence there, and the first time I read it, I had this feeling that I knew exactly what it was referring to, but I couldn't really put it into words. It was just kind of like the metaphorical meaning was transferred to my understanding. And all I could say is that this is somehow referring to the notion of the past somehow changing and thereby changing the future, perhaps towards a darker end. The way it is conveyed is so ominous and scary. Like, even if we try to set ourselves up for a good future, the past itself can change, thereby making that effort futile. So it's referring to retrocausality. And I don't know if this retrocausality is true or like a real thing in the world. But I think what's important is that the literature and the skill of the writing is helping our minds contemplate the idea, regardless of whether it corresponds to anything in reality. It's just kind of a mind-blowing thing to contemplate for its own sake. It is conveying a cool and complicated idea, and in this beautiful way, and trusting that the reader will get it. It's totally possible that you could read this and derive no meaning from it whatsoever, just given how complicated the writing is. But there is something there to interpret, and that's what I really love, is that despite all of the complexity, there seems to be a point. I haven't successfully interpreted everything which the book has to offer, but that so many things do seem to make sense is just really fascinating, and one of the things that keeps drawing me back to the book. Now, something that's commonly referred to in the book are shadows and the metaphors one can make out of shadows. I mean, the notion of shadows is important psychologically, and I think McCarthy is getting at some of that. But take this line, for example. They rode in a narrow enfilade along a trail strewn with the dry, round turds of goats, and they rode with their faces averted from the rock wall and the bake oven air which it rebaited. The slant black shapes of the mounted men stenciled across the stone, with a definition austere and implacable, like shapes capable of violating their covenant with the flesh that authored them, and continuing autonomous across the naked rock without reference to sun or man or God. So this is a stunning image involving shadows and the idea of the shadows continuing on without the person casting them. Again, it's a horrifying thing to contemplate. And I think one thing you can interpret from that is the idea of shadows having their own autonomy, just like they do in psychology, and maybe that's being referenced. You'll notice throughout the entire book there are references to shadows and things like shadows moving autonomously or taking on a life of their own relative to the beings that cast them. Another great line is this one. Under a gibbous moon, horse and rider spancelled to their shadows on the snow-blue ground, and in each flare of lightning, as the storm advanced, those self-same forms rearing with a terrible redundancy behind them, like some third aspect of their presence, hammered out black and wild upon the naked grounds. They rode on. They rode like men invested with a purpose whose origins were antecedent to them, like blood legatees of an order both imperative and remote. For although each man among them was discreet unto himself, conjoined they made a thing that had not been before, and in that communal soul were wastes hardly reckonable more than those whited regions on old maps where monsters do live, and where there is nothing other of the known world save conjectural winds. So again, we have this notion of the shadows being almost like a third aspect of these men. And this sense that their riding and their purpose in riding is not entirely clear to them, as though the communal soul they shared had its own purpose. And interestingly, this appears to be a reference to the notion of emergence, for each man is discrete unto himself, but conjoined they made a thing that had not been before. So this new kind of terrible single entity that has never before existed, something unprecedented in the history of the world, so as to be likened to the unmapped regions of the world, something that nobody before has ever encountered. And it's as though they're being driven on by their collective soul, as though the purpose of the company was not in line with their individual wills. And so, yeah, I found that one really, really cool. And that's what I mean. Like, there's a bit of philosophy in every little statement. It feels like so many of the paragraphs in this book have something fascinating to say. And here's another one that I really like. Deployed upon that plane, they moved in a constant elision, ordained agents of the actual dividing out of the world which they encountered, and leaving what had been and what would never be alike extinguished on the ground behind them. Spectre horsemen, pale with dust, anonymous in the crenellated heat. Above all, they appeared wholly at venture, primal, provisional, devoid of order, like beings provoked out of the absolute rock, and set nameless and at no remove from their own loomings, to wander ravenous and doomed and mute as gorgons, shambling the brutal wastes of Gondwanaland, in a time before nomenclature was, and each was all. So this speaks to the nature of the company and their task. They themselves are here to extinguish what exists. And I love the last sentence here, because that last little bit about nomenclature and Gondwanaland. If you don't know what Gondwanaland was, it was a supercontinent that was like the merger of all the continents that exist today, that existed before humans and therefore before nomenclature. Nomenclature is what allows our minds to divide up the world, using words to divide things into distinct entities. And so it's invoking this sense of a time before the world was divided into distinct entities and everything was like one thing. It's such a cool idea from a psychological perspective. The sense in which our minds and our words is what causes things to appear distinct. And before this, it's almost like all experience was merged into a single entity. Here's another great one. They crossed a vast dry lake with rows of dead volcanoes ranged beyond it like the works of enormous insects. To the south lay broken shapes of scoria, in a lava bed as far as the eye could see. Under the hooves of the horses, the alabaster sand shaped itself in whorls strangely symmetric, like iron filings in a field, and these shapes flared and drew back again, resonating upon that harmonic ground, and then turning to swirl away over the playa. as if the very sediment of things contained yet some residue of sentience, as if in the transit of those riders were a thing so profoundly terrible as to register even to the utmost granulation of reality. So it's not just invoking these higher, emergent, unprecedented entities that exist in the world, but the very granulation of reality, the very atoms. And I'll just let the beauty of that statement speak for itself. And there's one more I want to go through. The horses trudged sullenly the alien ground, and the round earth rolled beneath them, silently milling in the greater void wherein they were contained. In the neuter austerity of that terrain, all phenomena were bequeathed a strange equality, and no one thing, nor spider, nor stone, nor blade of grass, could put forth claim to precedence. The very clarity of these articles belied their familiarity, for the eye predicates the whole on some feature or part. And here nothing was more luminous than another, and nothing more enshadowed, and in the optical democracy of such landscapes, all preference is made whimsical, and a man and a rock become endowed with unguessed kinships. So we're circling around that idea again of the world being like this single entity, and nothing in particular stands out. And if you think about it, this is exactly what it means to exterminate. To kill. You're kind of like destroying these new phenomena and turning everything into one thing. It's very much like entropy and reducing the entire world to a single substance. Like when you burn something into ashes, all that's left are the ashes, and you can't tell one pile of ash from another. Whereas before, the things you burned might have been distinct from each other. So it speaks to the nature of extinction and destruction and entropy, which is what the gang is ultimately after as they kill more and more Indians. Okay, so now we come to what is probably the most famous monologue of the entire book. And again, it seems to be like the philosophical crux of the book, as though the entire book was building to this moment where the judge explains the nature of war. To set the stage, what's happening are, as usual, the characters are around a campfire, and this time they're discussing the nature of war, referencing the Bible, in fact. The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword, said the black. The judge smiled, his face shining with grease. What right man would have it any other way, he said. The good book does indeed count war and evil, said Irving, yet there's many a bloody tale of war inside it. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was, and will be. That way and not some other way. He turned to Brown, from whom he'd heard some whispered slur or demur. Ah, Davy, he said, it's your own trade we honor here. Why not rather take a small bow? Let each acknowledge each. So this begins with Black Jackson referencing the Bible and how it says in the Bible that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword. And the judge thinks this is great. This is actually the way things should be. And given everything that's happened in the book, it makes perfect sense that he's thinking this. For all the violence doled out by the gang, so much violence comes to them in response. And they're hunted and harried across the land. And while all of this is happening, and the company is clearly quite miserable, the one person who seems to be having a good time is the judge. He loves the fact that he's immersed in war and facing the consequences of his violence. For him, it seems to be like increasing the stakes, thereby increasing the amount of fun that he's having. But he also calls war the ultimate trade. So we have this idea of war itself being like a profession. In fact, the ultimate profession. And it's this notion which he continues to explain while discussing the nature of war. My trade? Certainly. What is my trade? War. War is your trade, is it not? And it ain't yours? Mine too, very much so. What about all them notebooks and bones and stuff? All other trades are contained in that of war. Is that why war endures? No. It endures because young men love it, and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. That's your notion. So this is where we get a bold-faced admission from the judge that all of his scientific endeavors were for the service of war. Something that we've seen already. But we also get the idea from him that the reason why war endures is because men love it. There's something fun about it. There's something thrilling. And this is actually something that's commonly heard from soldiers. I mean, yes, you'll hear soldiers explaining the horrors of war, but you also sometimes hear them explaining that it was fun, that it was kind of like a sport, where the goal was to win and defeat your opponents. And this is the notion which the judge is attempting to convey, that men are drawn to war, and that they love it because the stakes are so high. And we'll see this argument continue as the judge's monologue continues. The judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have any meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war. For here, that which is wagered swallows up game, player, all. Suppose 2 men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is a preference absolute and irrevocable. And it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. So here we see that the judge is ultimately comparing war to game. For him, it's some kind of sport. In fact, the ultimate sport, because the stakes are raised to the absolute maximum. There is no greater stake than your own life. And so for him, defeating your enemy proves that you have a right to exist and he does not. War ultimately proves the worth of the one who is victorious in war. And this seems to be the nature of war. War determines which nation survives and which goes extinct. War determines which culture flourishes and which is eradicated. And war determines which individuals get to go on living, and which are annihilated and relegated to the dustbin of history. And so that's why he calls it a testing of wills. And that's perhaps what is ultimately motivating the judge. He sees war as this game which will ultimately prove his superiority to all other people. And so his scientific pursuits are all in service to war. And it's very much the case that the more scientifically gifted side will often win the war. They have better information, they have better technology. And so it not only proves your strength, it proves your intelligence. And I can see what he means when he compares war to a game, but also calls war the ultimate game. I remember while studying Napoleon's campaigns, I got this impression that this man can just do whatever he wants. When you're playing the game of war, there really are no rules. I mean, yeah, sure, there are war crimes, but insofar as there is nobody to enforce those war crimes, they don't exist. And so you can do whatever you need to do to win. You need to be duplicitous and deceiving. And because the stakes are so high, war becomes elevated to like this ultimate game. And whoever is able to win is often rewarded greatly. Whether it's a nation taking more land, or ruling over other people, or just simply stealing all the stuff they possess. It really paints reality as just so stark and bleak, and really justifies the book's themes of the Earth just being this terrible place to inhabit. If this is the nature of things, no doubt that's the case. But the judge's monologue goes on. Brown studied the judge. "You're crazy, Holden. Crazy at last." The judge smiled. "Might does not make right," said Irving. "The man that wins in combat is not vindicated morally." So we'll pause here because, just because you use duplicity to win in a war doesn't mean that you were on the right side of things or that you were right morally. Very often, the side that's actually morally right doesn't necessarily win the final battle. But here's the judge's response. "Moral law is an invention of mankind for the disenfranchisement of the powerful in favor of the weak. Historical law subverts it at every turn. A moral view can never be proven right or wrong by any ultimate test. A man falling dead in a duel is not thought thereby to be proven in error as to his views. His very involvement in such a trial gives evidence of a new and broader view. The willingness of the principles to forego further argument as the triviality which it in fact is, and to petition directly the chambers of the historical absolute, are the opinions, and of what great moment the divergences thereof. For the argument is indeed trivial, but not so the separate wills thereby made manifest. Man's vanity may well approach the infinite in capacity, but his knowledge remains imperfect, and however much he comes to value his judgments, ultimately he must submit them before a higher court. Here there can be no special pleading. Here are considerations of equity and rectitude and moral right rendered void and without warrant, and here are the views of the litigants despised. Decisions of life and death, of what shall be and what shall not, beggar all question of right. In elections of these magnitudes are all lesser ones subsumed, moral, spiritual, natural. Now, anybody who's a moral realist would read this with their head spinning, and it's kind of nauseating to even think about, because it's kind of just dispensing with the notion of morality entirely. That's the sort of person the judge is. And this is very Nietzschean in its argument, calling morality disenfranchisement of the powerful in favor of the weak. That's very much Nietzsche's view, that morality is some way to claim that the powerful are inferior to the weak, especially in a moral sense. And the judge has a really good point, one that I can't easily disprove despite being a moral realist, which is that you can't prove a moral view right or wrong. You simply believe in it, and it is an invention. It is something that we've created. Morality doesn't seem to exist in nature. It seems to exist as something that humans create for their own good. And the judge is simply pointing this out, and pointing out the fact that winning in war somehow dispenses with this entirely, and in fact is more ultimate in its decisions than something like morality, because it ultimately decides who survives. And in that sense, the one who is victorious in war has won. I mean, this very much assumes that there is nothing after death, and that the only place that exists is the universe. And so it's really, really cynical, like deeply cynical, probably the most cynical thing I've ever read. And just pure evil. And yet I can't really find a fault with what the judge is saying. And so, yeah, there's likely more and more to continue to analyze just in this speech alone. Maybe I'll make a separate video just for analyzing what the judge has to say about war and really going through all the little details. But of course, feel free to continue reading this and trying to figure out if there's further meaning to it. So let's continue with the plot and start explaining some of the things that happen plot-wise, because it's really rather bizarre, astonishing, and something is going on. Something really twisted and dark is taking place, which is super hard to interpret. Now, there's a character in the book which you wouldn't expect to be so important, and it's this severely handicapped man who's clearly mentally impaired, and throughout the book, they simply call him the idiot, or the imbecile, or the fool. And for some reason, the judge just seems super fascinated with this guy, for reasons that are not super clear. And even after reading the book several times, I only have a few speculations as to what is even going on. But the judge is really fascinated by this man. He has a brother who's more put together mentally, and the judge just spends a bunch of time studying this man. It's as though this is like another phenomenon in nature which has the judge's curiosity. And so they begin to travel with this man and his brother. The idea is that they're going to take them to California. And as they're transporting him, there's some writing that goes like this. On the day following, they crossed the Malpais afoot, leading the horses upon a lake bed of lava, all cracked and reddish black, like a pan of dried blood, threading those badlands of dark amber glass, like the remnants of some dim legion scrabbling up out of a land accursed, shouldering the little cart over the rifts and ledges, the idiot clinging to the bars and calling hoarsely after the sun, like some queer, unruly god abducted from a race of degenerates. They crossed a cinderland of caked slurry and volcanic ash, imponderable as the burnt-out floor of hell, and they climbed up through a low range of barren granite hills to a stark promontory where the judge, triangulating from known points of landscape, reckoned anew their course. So even in this transport, you get the sense that there's something weird going on with this idiot, this fool, as they transport him. And eventually there's a scene where the fool escapes from his cage, or actually no, he doesn't escape from his cage. What happens are a bunch of women find him in a cage, and they scold his brother, and they try to wash up and clean this man and show him some dignity. But while everyone is sleeping, the idiot wakes up and walks straight into the river, seemingly to drown himself. Maybe not deliberately, but that seems to be the consequence. And then this happens. Now, the judge on his midnight rounds was passing along at just this place, stark naked himself, such encounters being commoner than men suppose, or who would survive any crossing by night, and he stepped into the river and seized up the drowning idiot, snatching it aloft by the heels like some great midwife, and slapping it on the back to let the water out. A birth scene, or a baptism, or some ritual not yet inaugurated into any canon. He twisted the water from its hair, and he gathered up the naked and sobbing fool into his arms, and carried it up into the camp, and restored it among its fellows. So yeah, this is what I mean. Something weird is going on with this character. So the gang eventually comes to the Colorado River, and they come across this ferry being run by a doctor that's carrying passengers from one side to the other. And they convince some Yumas, another indigenous group, to attack the ferry, only to betray the Yumas and pretend to defend the ferry using a massive howitzer to rip the attacking Yumas to shreds. And then they take over the ferry and basically just rob everyone who attempts to use it to cross the river. But then the Yumas return, and there are many hints that it was the judge who conspired with the Yumas to do so. He has seemingly betrayed Glanton, or orchestrated events so that the Glanton gang is slaughtered. Glanton is killed, and the judge escapes, and for some reason he takes the idiot with him, like holding him on a leash like a dog. The kid and a few others fight a running engagement from the Yumas, and the kid's good pistol shooting keeps the enemy at bay and eventually forces them into a retreat. And when some of them are finally getting some rest by a well, they spot two figures approaching them, which turn out to be the judge and the fool. They were both of them naked, and they neared through the desert dawn like beings of a mode little more than tangential to the world at large, their figures now quick with clarity, and now fugitive in the strangeness of that same light. Like things whose very portent renders them ambiguous, like things so charged with meaning that their forms are dimmed. The three at the well watched mutely this transit out of the breaking day, and even though there was no longer any question as to what it was that approached, yet none would name it. They lumbered on, the judge a pale pink beneath his talc of dust, like something newly born, the imbecile much the darker, lurching together across the pan at the very extremes of exile, like some scurrilous king stripped of his vestiture, and driven together with his fool into the wilderness to die. Those who travel in desert places do indeed meet with creatures surpassing all description. So, this image, which appears in the book, of the judge and the fool, both of them naked. By the way, the judge is often naked throughout the book. He's often dancing naked or like naked upon the walls of buildings. But here you have the two of them together. And clearly, by the way McCarthy describes it, there's something very deeply meaningful about this image. In fact, so meaningful that it's rendered ambiguous. Which is honestly such a cool thing to read. Something so charged with meaning that it's rendered ambiguous. Which I think is often the case with things that contain so much meaning, like dreams. Like dreams are, they contain so much meaning, and yet they're so hard to decipher. And it's almost like the two go hand in hand. The more meaning you stuff into something, the harder it is to actually make meaning out of it. But anyways, let's try to make meaning out of what's going on here. So the fact that they're walking together makes it seem like they're equalized in some way. They're equivalent, like they're able to walk with one another. And yet they couldn't be more different. The judge is extremely intelligent. The idiot is, well, an idiot, which I feel bad for saying because he's clearly mentally handicapped, but nevertheless. One is in total control, one can talk, the other can't say a single word. And so what does unite them? What is the similarity between these two characters? And I think ultimately it's the fact that neither of them care at all about what other people think. They are so themselves. That's clear from the idiot. Like he has no notion that other people are even there. He can barely register the existence of other humans. And the people who try to help him, the second they do, the first thing he does is to go into the river and drown himself. So there's a sense in which he does not care at all what other people think. And the judge is the same. He absolutely does not care what other people think. He's willing to go on monologuing, completely aware that nobody even understands what he's saying. And he's obsessed with his own freedom. So McCarthy is pointing to some equivalence between these two. And I think this is the equivalence, that they both simply are themselves and are simply free to be themselves without caring at all what other people think about them. Now, there might be more going on here. It is a really stirring image, especially the image of like this mentally handicapped man. There's something very, very dark about it, especially what happens later. But I also think it highlights that whatever the judge is doing here, he's on some like otherworldly quest that other people simply cannot understand. And there's this tense scene that follows at the well where the judge attempts to barter for the kid's pistol, but the kid seemingly no longer trusts the judge and refuses. The ex priest even urges the kid to shoot the judge while he has a chance. And this starts to reveal that the judge, even though he's some supernatural being, is not entirely invulnerable. Because he wants the kid's pistol and is willing to trade a huge amount of money for it, but the kid refuses. And remember, the judge is obsessed with power, obsessed with manipulating other people, and so it must be really hard for him to face this kid who's not bowing to his will. There's something about the judge which also makes him feel like he's exiled. Like, yeah, he's supernatural and has all of these powers, but at the same time, he's somehow in this universe and somehow also puzzled by it. He doesn't know everything, for which reason he tries to explore and try to understand things. It's like he's this weird demonic entity that's spawned amongst humans and is now playing this game, having as much fun as possible all the while. But the kid spares him, so he doesn't shoot him. But later, the judge comes for the kid and the ex priest. The fool at his side, he's using the fool almost like a tracker or something. And this intense cat and mouse hunt ensues. The judge attempts to hunt down the kid, and for some reason, this whole time, he's like carrying around a meat umbrella. So yeah, it's something extra weird, and something which I don't think is meant to be deciphered. You're only supposed to take away that something really, really bizarre is happening with the judge. So this is a really cool and epic scene, but eventually the Tobin and the kid survive and are rescued from the verge of death by Indians, Digueños to be exact. Amazingly, right? Because the very same people that they had spent all this time trying to drive into extinction end up being the ones to rescue them. Again, showing the kind of complexity of human nature. And there's something really eerie about the way that they're described. They were armed with short bows, and they drew about the travelers and knelt and gave them water out of a gourd. They'd seen such pilgrims before, with sufferings more terrible. They eked a desperate living from that land, and they knew that nothing excepting some savage pursuit could drive men to such plight, and they watched each day for that thing to gather itself out of its terrible incubation in the house of the sun, and muster along the edge of the eastern world, and whether it be armies or plague or pestilence or something altogether unspeakable, they waited with a strange equanimity. So these people are taking a completely different attitude to the chaos in the world. They're simply waiting for it, acknowledging that it's kind of an inevitability. But they eventually make it to San Diego, and the kid is arrested. It's not clear what happens to the ex-priest at that point, but the kid is arrested, and in prison, he meets the judge. The judge leaves the kid to rot in prison, claiming that it was the kid who actually betrayed the company, so lying to the authorities and framing the kid. But later, the kid is let out of prison. He finds a doctor to perform surgery, and when the kid is rendered unconscious by spirits of ether, he dreams about the judge. In that sleep and in sleeps to follow, the judge did visit. Who would come other? A great shambling mutant, silent and serene. Whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other to their sum, nor was there system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go. Whoever would seek out his history, through whatever unraveling of loins and ledger books, must stand at last, darkened and dumb, at the shore of a void without terminus or origin, and whatever science he might bring to bear upon the dusty primal matter blowing down out of the millennia, will discover no trace of any ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon his commencing. In the white and empty room, he stood in his bespoken suit, with his hat in his hand, and he peered down with his small and lashless pig's eyes, wherein this child, just 16 years on earth, could read whole bodies of decisions, not accountable to the courts of men, and he saw his own name, which nowhere else he could have ciphered out at all, logged into the records as a thing already accomplished, a traveler known in jurisdictions, existing only in the claims of certain pensioners or on old dated maps. So let's pause here because it's a really interesting image, the idea that there is no ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon the commencing of the judge, as though he's always existed, as though he's older than time itself, as though he's existed eternally. Anyone familiar with the imagery of the atavistic egg from depth psychology or from mythology, from creation stories, knows that this is the origin point, the beginning. But the fact that there is no ultimate atavistic egg demonstrates that the judge is an entity entirely different. And if he is some representation of war, maybe this is saying that war has always existed. There's never been a point when war didn't exist, that it's more fundamental than the universe itself. But the dream goes on, and it becomes interesting because we get this image, which is rather striking and which gives hints into what the judge is judge of. In his delirium, he ransacked the linens of his pallet for arms, but there were none. The judge smiled. The fool was no longer there, but another man, and this other man he could never see in his entirety. But he seemed an artisan and a worker in metal. The judge enshadowed him where he crouched at his trade, but he was a cold forger who worked with hammer and die, perhaps under some indictment and in exile from men's fires, hammering out, like his own conjectural destiny, all through the night of his becoming some coinage for a dawn that would not be. All through the night of his becoming some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer, with his gravers and burns, who seeks favor with the judge. And he is at contriving from cold slag, brute in the crucible, a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. So we have this metaphorical image, and we are told that this is what the judge is judge of, and that the night does not end. So what is going on here? So we have this man making counterfeit coins, and he's apparently exiled from men's fires. And he's trying to make the coins convincing enough that they'll be passed for actual currency. And he's out in the cold, like he's out in dead space, away from other men, away from any other fires. And the judge enshadow's him. And for some reason, he seeks favor with the judge. So maybe there's something about lying. I mean, lying is actually a big thing that happens in the book. Like, characters lie, and it's kind of like nauseating to hear their lies because you know as the reader that they're just full of shit. And so maybe the judge is the one that determines whether lies succeed, whether duplicity actually succeeds in its task. I also had the idea the first few times I came across this, that maybe the judge has something to do with judging the value of money, i.e. judging what men are willing to do for money. Maybe he determines what lengths men are willing to go to seek money. There is a sense in which this moneyer, this person making these counterfeit coins, is doing so in the dark, away from other people's judgments. Why is it that the judge has something to do with this counterfeit money? And it's our only hint of what the judge is ultimately a judge of. It's not a super clear hint, and I'm actually kind of running out of ideas for what this could mean. And if you have any ideas and would like to analyze this further, because it is a dream, and you could treat it like dream analysis, feel free to leave it in the comments and share some ideas. Okay, so many years go by, and the kid is no longer called the kid. This dream is the last that he sees of the judge. And by the end of the book, he's now called the man. It's been several years. He hasn't seen the judge in all that time. And he works at various trades, and he comes across this buffalo hunter. And the way this is described is really cool, and I think says a lot. It was an old hunter in camp, and the hunter shared tobacco with him, and told him of the buffalo, and the stands he'd made against them, laid up in a sag on some rise with the dead animals scattered over the grounds, and the herd beginning to mill, and the rifle barrels so hot that the wiping patches sizzled in the bore, and the animals by the thousands and tens of thousands, and the hides pegged out over actual square miles of ground, and the teams of skinners spelling one another around the clock, and the shooting and shooting, weeks and months, till the boar shot slick, and the stock shot loose at the tang, and their shoulders were yellow and blue to the elbow, and the tandem wagons groaned away over the prairie 20 and 22 ox teams, and the flint hides by the ton and 100 ton, and the meat rotting on the ground, and the air whining with flies, and the buzzards and ravens, and the night a horror of snarling, and the feeding with the wolves half crazed, and wallowing in the carrion. I seen Studebaker wagons with 6 and 8 ox teams headed out for the grounds, not hauling a thing but weed, just pure hoena, tons of it. On this ground alone, between the Arkansas River and the Concho, there was 8 million carcasses, for that's how many hides reached the railhead. 2 years ago, we pulled out from Griffin for a last hunt. We ransacked the country. 6 weeks. Finally, we found a herd of 8 animals, and we killed them and come in. They're gone. Every one of them that God ever made is gone, as if they'd never been at all. The ragged sparks blew down the wind. The prairie about them lay silent. Beyond the fire, it was cold, and the night was clear, and the stars were falling. The old hunter pulled his blanket about him. I wonder if there's other worlds like this one, he said, or if this is the only one. I think what I love about this so much is that it really generalizes the violence. Like, yeah, we've been seeing this gang mercilessly hunt down the Indians. But is that really so different from what's happened with Manifest Destiny? This ceaseless striving to just hunt everything that exists, to dominate nature, to kill every single buffalo. The killing that takes place just seems so normal, just seems so much a feature of what it means to be a human. And just think about how many species we've driven to extinction. And then another scene ensues where the kid ends up killing this young man who was an orphan, and in fact leaving another kid orphaned by doing so. There's a lot of depth to this whole conversation, and it actually harkens back to one of the earlier parts of the book. And its effect seems to be that the man, as he's now called, re-encounters the judge. He goes to this saloon in Texas, and there is the judge waiting for him. He was sitting at one of the tables. He wore a round hat with a narrow brim, and he was among every kind of man: herder and bullwhacker and drover and fighter and miner and hunter and soldier and peddler and gambler and drifter and drunkard and thief, and he was among the dregs of the earth and beggary 1,000 years, and he was among the scapegrace scions of eastern dynasties, and in all that motley assemblage he sat by them, and yet alone, as if he were some sort of other man entire, and he seemed little changed or none in all these years. In this bar, there's a bear dancing on the stage, and what happens next sets the tone for the ending of this book. On the boards, the bear was dancing for all that his heart was worth, and the girl cranked the organ handle, and the shadow of the act which the candlelight constructed upon the wall might have gone begging for reference in any daylight world. When he looked back, the showman had donned the hat, and he stood with his hands on his hips. One of the men had drawn a long-barreled cavalry pistol from his belt. He turned and leveled the pistol toward the stage. Some dove for the floor, some reached for their own arms. The owner of the bear stood up like a pitchman in a shooting gallery. The shot was thunderous, and in the afterclap, all sound in that room ceased. The bear had been shot through the midsection. He let out a low moan, and he began to dance faster, dancing in silence save for the slap of his great foot pads upon the planks. Blood was running down his groin. The little girl strapped into the barrel organ stood frozen, the crank at rest on the upswing. The man with the pistol fired again, and the pistol bucked and roared, and the black smoke rolled, and the bear groaned and began to reel drunkenly. He was holding his chest, and a thin foam of blood swung from his jaw, and he began to totter and to cry like a child, and he took a few last steps, dancing, and crashed to the boards. Like, okay, that's a disturbing image, but let's see where it goes. The judge walks up to the kid, and the kid attempts to look beyond him, but apparently that great corpus shadowed all from beyond. And the judge begins to monologue again. I recognized you when I first saw you, and yet you were a disappointment to me. Then and now. Even so, at the last, I find you here with me. I ain't with you. The judge raised his bald brow. Not, he said. He looked about him in a puzzled and artful way, and he was a passable thespian. I never come here hunting you. What then? Said the judge. What would I want with you? I come here same reason as any man. And what reason is that? What reason is what? That these men are here. They come here to have a good time. The judge watched him. He began to point out various men in the room, and to ask if these men were here for a good time, or if indeed they knew why they were here at all. This is when the judge becomes just crazy existential, and even creepier than he has managed to be throughout this whole book, and seems to refer ultimately to what this place is, what is reality, what is existence. And so he launches into a new monologue. This is an orchestration for an event, for a dance in fact. The participants will be apprised of their roles at the proper time. For now it is enough that they have arrived. As the dance is the thing with which we are concerned, and contains complete within itself its own arrangement and history and finale, there is no necessity that the dancers contain these things within themselves. In any event, the history of all is not the history of each, nor indeed the sum of those histories, and none here can finally comprehend the reason for his presence, for he has no way of knowing even in what the event consists. In fact, were he to know, he might well absent himself, and you can see that that cannot be any part of the plan, if plan there be. So he starts to really ask the question of what is existence? What is this event that we're all in, this world that we all find ourselves contained within? And he says that it's like a dance. This implies that it's just for fun, but it also implies that it's being orchestrated, perhaps by him. Perhaps he's the one ultimately driving history forward. And he points to the fact that none of us can even understand in what the event consists, which is very much the case. We're born into this world not understanding what it is. And still, nobody really understands what this place is. There are all sorts of ideas, but it doesn't seem possible for our minds to fully comprehend what reality actually consists of. And in fact, it seems to be the point that we don't know, that we don't understand what this world is, that it is a mystery, that it is puzzling. That seems to be part of the design, if there is a design. And if we were to know, we might well absent ourselves, thereby not really engaging in life. This is an interesting thing because this is something that you often hear from people who smoke DMT. They come back apparently having learned the mysteries of life, but also recognizing that if the more they know about those mysteries, the harder it is to actually live as a human being. There's some necessity of forgetting what's on the outside of this place in order to actually function and participate in it. And it's just so cool that Cormac McCarthy is talking about this. And then the judge declares that life, all of it, all of its carnage and all of its violence and calamity, is some kind of ritual. An event, a ceremony, the orchestration thereof. The overture carries certain marks of decisiveness. It includes the slaying of a large bear. The evening's progress will not appear strange or unusual, even to those who question the tightness of the events so ordered. A ceremony, then. One could argue that there are not categories of no ceremony, but only ceremonies of greater or lesser degree, and deferring to this argument, we will say that this is a ceremony of a certain magnitude, perhaps more commonly called a ritual. A ritual includes the letting of blood. Rituals which fail in this requirement are but mock rituals. Here, every man knows the false at once. Never doubt it. That feeling in the breast that evokes a child's memory of loneliness, such as when the others have gone and only the game is left with its solitary participant, a solitary game without opponent, where only the rules are at hazard. Don't look away. We are not speaking in mysteries. You of all men are no stranger to that feeling, the emptiness and despair. It is that which we take arms against, is it not? Is not blood the tempering agent of the mortar which bonds? The judge leaned closer. What do you think death is, man? Of whom do we speak when we speak of a man who was and is not? Are these blind riddles, or are they some part of every man's jurisdiction? What is death if not an agency? And whom does he intend to ward? Look at me. So the judge is claiming that existence is some kind of blood ritual, which really adds in the creepiness factor to this ending. And he starts to ask these really creepy questions of like, what is death? What does it mean to die? What does it mean for someone to have used to have existed? And isn't it necessary for everybody to be pondering these questions? And he claims that blood is the tempering agent in the mortar which bonds. That like the spilling of blood somehow unites us. And maybe it does. Maybe it did the Glanton gang. Maybe that's why they were so united. Because of their shared purpose of spilling the blood of innocence. So the kid is really freaked out by these existential questions, and he expresses what we're all thinking. I don't like craziness. I should pause here as well, that every time the judge monologues, the characters themselves think that he's completely crazy, because he is completely crazy. McCarthy has this awareness that what he's saying through the judge comes off as utter lunacy, and yet it's so smart, and it's so articulately put. But let me continue. I don't like craziness. Nor I, nor I. Bear with me. Look at them now. Pick a man. Any man. That man there. See him? That man hatless. You know his opinion of the world. You can read it in his face, in his stance. Yet his complaint that a man's life is no bargain masks the actual case with him, which is that men will not do as he wishes them to do. Have never done, never will do. That's the way of things with him, and his life is so bulked about by difficulty, and becomes so altered of its intended architecture, that he is little more than a walking hovel, hardly fit to house the human spirit at all. Can he say, such a man, that there is no malign thing set against him? That there is no power and no force and no cause? What manner of heretic could doubt agency and claimant alike? Can he believe that the wreckage of his existence is unentailed? No liens, no creditors? That gods of vengeance and of compassion alike lie sleeping in their crypt, and whether our cries are for an accounting, or for the destruction of the ledgers altogether, they must evoke only the same silence, and that it is this silence which will prevail? To whom is he talking, man? Can't you see him? A man seeks his own destiny, and no other, said the judge. Will or nil, Any man who could discover his own fate and elect therefore some opposite course could only come at last to that self-same reckoning at the appointed time, for each man's destiny is as large as the world he inhabits, and contains within it all opposites as well. This desert, upon which so many have been broken, is vast, and calls for largeness of heart, but it is ultimately empty. It is hard, it is barren. Its very nature is stone. He poured the tumbler full. Drink up, he said. The world goes on. We have dancing nightly, and this night is no exception. The straight and the winding way are one, and now that you are here, what do the years count since last we two met together? Men's memories are uncertain, and the past that was differs little from the past that was not. He took up the tumbler the judge had poured, and he drank and set it down again. He looked at the judge. I've been everywhere, he said. This is just one more place. So even in the midst of all of this craziness, which the judge is unleashing upon the kid seems to be resisting him, not just going along with what he's saying, but actually trying to stand his ground. And the judge is making all of these grandiose claims about the nature of reality, the nature of fate. And I think in the future, I'll make a video dedicated to just this ending and analyzing all that's going on, because I feel like this video is already way too long. But the judge goes on. The judge arched his brow. Did you post witnesses, he said, to report to you on the continuing existence of those places once you'd quit them? That's crazy. Is it? Where is yesterday? Where is Glanton and Brown? And where is the priest? He leaned closer. Where is Shelby, whom you left to the mercies of Elias in the desert? And where is Tate, whom you abandoned in the mountains? Where are the ladies, the fair and tender ladies with whom you danced at the governor's ball, when you were a hero, anointed with the blood of the enemies of the republic you'd elected to defend? And where is the fiddler, and where the dance? I guess you can tell me. I tell you this. As war becomes dishonored, and its nobility called into question, those honorable men who recognize the sanctity of blood will become excluded from the dance, which is the warrior's right, and thereby will the dance become a false dance, and the dancers false dancers. And yet there will be one there, always, who is a true dancer. And can you guess who that might be? You ain't nothing. You speak truer than you know, but I will tell you, only that man who has offered up himself entire to the blood of war, who has been to the floor of the pit and seen horror in the round, and learned at last that it speaks to his inmost heart, only that man can dance. Even a dumb animal can dance. The judge set the bottle on the bar. Hear me, man, he said. There is room on the stage for one beast and one alone. All others are destined for a night that is eternal and without name. All others are destined for a night that is eternal and without name. One by one, they will step down into the darkness before the footlamps. Bears that dance, bears that don't. So this monologue has a lot of ideas, complicated ideas, which the judge is conveying. More ideas about the nature of fate, as well as more ideas about the nature of war, and how war is the truest form of divination. And only one who is as violent as the judge is really living, is really engaged in life. And such a man is the only one that can dance in this ritual. So in the future, I'm probably going to be making a video dedicated entirely to this ending and to this monologue. I don't have much to say about it now. But basically what happens next is that the kid goes upstairs to spend some time with a whore. And then when he goes outside to the outhouses, this is what happens next. The judge was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling and gathered him in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh, and shot the wooden bar latch home behind him. Two men walk by the outhouse to see what's going on, and when they look inside, something indescribably horrible and monstrous is taking place, to the point where they can't even describe it. And so at last, the judge takes the kid. It's implied that maybe he sexually assaults him, which, if you think about it, is the ultimate way of showing you have power over someone else. And maybe that's what the judge wanted all along, to prove that the kid didn't have his own agency and would ultimately submit to the judge's agency. So after doing something unspeakable to the kid, the judge comes back to rejoin the dance, and this is how the book ends. And they are dancing, the board floor slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grinning hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sachets backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat, and he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die. So at this point, if you're a reasonable person, you're probably asking yourself, what the fuck? Like, what is this? What is this ending? It's really dark and cynical, that ultimately in the end, it's the judge who wins. To me, it felt like this massive middle finger. And yet, I find it such a powerful ending, which hammers home many of the themes of the book. One more time, before the judge nakedly dances and just has a great time. And that really finally speaks to what his character is. He's someone who's here to just have a good time, mindlessly doing whatever he wants, and playing the ultimate game of war. The book also has this epilogue, which I'll include here. In the dawn, there is a man progressing over the plain by means of holes, which he is making in the ground. He uses an implement with 2 handles, and he chucks it into the hole, and he enkindles the stone in the hole, with his steel hole by hole, striking the fire out of the rock which God has put there. On the plain behind him are the wanderers in search of bones, and those who do not search, and they move haltingly in the light, like mechanisms whose movements are monitored with escapement and palate, so that they appear restrained by a prudence or reflectiveness, which has no inner reality, and they cross in their progress one by one that track of holes that runs to the rim of the visible ground, and which seems less the pursuit of some continuance than the verification of a principle, a validation of sequence and causality, as if each round and perfect hole owed its existence to the one before it, there on that prairie, upon which are the bones and the gatherers of bones, and those who do not gather. He strikes fire in the hole and draws out his steel. Then they all move on again. So this is a very ambiguous epilogue, which I think is intended to get the fundamental point of the book across, which is, again, man's will versus the will of God. But I'll let you attempt to decipher what's going on here, because at this point my brain is pretty exhausted from going through this entire book in a single lecture. So yeah, I'm curious to hear what all of you have to say about the book, if you've read it, if you want to read it now, if there are any other deeper themes that you've noticed in the writing that I've included, or if there's anything you felt like I've missed or misinterpreted. I'm curious to hear it all. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I enjoyed making this. I enjoyed reading the book. I'm probably done reading it now, and I'll probably move on to one of McCarthy's other books, currently reading The Road, which has been pretty good so far. But yeah, so thank you so much. Take care. Have a good day.